in the room and also online. Welcome to Professor Max Donelan's KITE Research Rounds. Professor Donelan is at Simon Fraser University, and his work studies how people and other animals move and walk. He has held Career Investigator Awards from the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research and also the CIHR. He was a scientific board member for Nike and Lululemon and an advisory board member for Stanford University's Mobilize Center of Excellence. He's founded two companies, Bionic Power, which develops energy harvesting technologies for people whose lives depend on portable power, and Control Freak, which develops wearable technology for regulating exercise using music. His newest role is as founding scientific co-director of WearTech Labs, which is a core facility at Simon Fraser University that works with academia and industry to research and develop wearable technologies that improve our lives. Please join me in a welcome round of applause.
Mic working now? Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, we've been fighting some technical issues, which we think we solved, but if we encounter them again, just bear with me and we will solve them again. Thank you very much for having me. It's really my pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you about one aspect of my research, which is about energy optimization in human walking. And it's, perhaps, can this be a little bit lower? Is that possible? Feels a little too high for me in the speakers. Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. So perhaps one of the most fundamental things we know about human walking is that for healthy humans, they choose the way they walk in order to minimize energetic cost. This isn't necessarily a conscious choice, but if we just go out and measure people's preferred behavior, we discover that their patterns of walking are the ones that are the cheapest. And you can see that in these two plots. This is, This is an old figure from Ralston from 1958 that showed this original behavior. This is speed on the x-axis, energy use on the y-axis. You don't need to know the units so much, but it's basically how many calories you're using per unit time. And if you can measure this at a range of speeds, from slow speeds up to fast speeds, and you'd find this parabolic shape where there is a minimum. And then if you ask people to choose their preferred speed, they wouldn't choose to walk with very slow speeds or very fast speeds. They would choose this just right speed where energy is minimized. This is for speed. If you did the same thing, if you fix speed, for example, like on a treadmill, and you had people walk at a range of stride frequencies from slow stride frequencies up to fast stride frequencies, again, you'd map out this sort of parabolic relationship. And if then you asked people to choose what they preferred, what they would settle on is the minimum of this bowl, right? That they prefer the stride frequency that minimizes their energetic cost when given that choice. This isn't to say that you sometimes don't want to walk at a faster speed, for example. Like if you had to walk faster to catch a bus, then you would shift and move at something that is more costly. But even within that speed constraint to catch the bus, there's lots of flexibility. For example, you still get to choose what stride frequency you use. And it turns out that people, given that constraint, will still settle on the stride frequency for that constraint that minimizes cost. And we don't know really any major deviations from this pattern. This is a very general phenomenon for healthy people. Now, I know many of you in the room study people with various gait disorders, and you might think, well, my patients aren't minimizing energetic cost. I think many of you don't even know if that's true, because it's not often measured. But this principle of optimization, I think, likely extends beyond energy. It applies to other objective functions you might have. So for example, maybe it's stability, or maybe it's some combination of stability and energetic cost. And the principles that I'm going to talk to you about how the nervous system accomplishes this optimization may apply to other objective functions than just energetic cost. It might apply to movements beyond walking, but we can use studying walking and energetic cost as an insight into the nervous system's ways of doing optimization for all kinds of movement. Okay, so I forgot to say, if you have questions as I'm going along, you should absolutely interrupt. I much prefer that this is interactive than me just stand up here and talk. Yeah, Brock. can you give me an example of the long-term, the negative consequences?
Yeah, so say I have a unilateral amputation, I'm
Yeah.
incurring some gait, and you assume that this is somehow optimal for some objective function, you don't know what that is. This may have long-term negative consequences where you have maybe imbalanced loading. But
Yeah.
the user preferred that because it was comfortable, but this could have long-term consequences like, bone or joint
Right.
degeneration.
I don't think we know, but I think it's possible that the nervous system still cares about energetic cost to the detriment of things like what you're saying. Is that maybe there's no sensor of bone degradation, it's not incorporated into the nervous system's objective function, and so at the expense of bone, you keep minimizing energetic cost. That is a possibility. But also, like, another version of it is where you have pain due to the damage of the stump or something like that. And you can imagine where you prioritize pain over energy in walking, but it's still optimization. It's just now you have another term in the objective function.
Yeah, I was linking this back to rehabilitation.
Yeah.
So if we try to design interventions or technology to then coincide with someone's minimum of whatever it is, this could have actually negative long-term consequences.
Great. Was there another question? Looked like you might have been raising your hand. No? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, thank you for modeling perfectly how to ask questions during the talk. That's great. Okay, so this behavior has been known for a long time, this phenomenon. But what is unknown is, when we started, was over what time scale it happens. Maybe this is energy optimization is arrived at over evolutionary time, or maybe it's something you do over developmental time. So as you learn to walk as from an infant up till now, or maybe it's done in real time. Maybe the nervous system is able to sense energetic cost and minimize cost in real time. Okay? And that's the first question we set out to ask, is can that be done? So I want you to consider this hypothetical experiment, which will then no longer be hypothetical in the next slide. And that is, what if we could take people's, this parabola I showed on the right-hand parabola on the other slide. If we took this cost landscape, where energy is on this axis, in this case it's per unit time, and step frequency is on this axis, where they're at 0% is the preferred step frequency, and so that there's this bowl where the minimum occurs the preferred, and it's more expensive if you go to higher step frequencies, and more expensive if you go to lower step frequencies. What if we could shift that bowl? And so that the minimum now occurs at a higher step frequency. And we can shift that bowl by applying a penalty that's a function of their step frequency. So if we penalize low step frequencies and make that penalty decrease as you go to high step frequencies, it'll take that penalty gets added to this gray bowl, and you end up with this red bowl where the minimum is shifted to higher step frequencies. So you need a step frequency dependent energetic penalty. And the question would be, can people learn? Will they discover this new energetic minimum, and under what situations and over what time? Right? How quickly can they do this? Does it need to be over their full, like, do you need to do this to children? Or do you need to do this to our ancestors? Or can we do this in real time? And you can do the opposite thing. You can add a penalty to the high step frequencies that decreases as you go to low and shift the bowl in the other direction. And that would be a strong test that they're doing energy minimization if you can shift them in either direction. Okay, so this is what we set out to do. And we did it using a exoskeleton that acts about the knee joint that was designed to do energy harvesting, but we use it in this case to provide controlled resistive torques to the knee joint that were under our control. And we made those resistive torques a function of their step frequency. So the idea here is we made the resistive torque high when they're at low step frequencies, and then would go down for the high step frequencies, and that would take this gray bowl and shift it into this red bowl for this penalized low condition. And then we can do the opposite. We could also penalize high and shift in the opposite direction. So this was, turns out, when we did this to people, we would penalize their gait as a function of their step frequency, but they didn't even know. They didn't realize that the resistive torque we were providing them was a function of how they were moving. And we could determine that using surveys at the end, and we could also have subsequently done distractor experiments where we purposely distracted them with a secondary task. They still do the optimization, even though they have no awareness that things are changing. Okay, we measure energetic costs by measuring how much oxygen people are consuming and how much carbon dioxide they're producing. And this is what it looks like. There may be volume somewhere for this. This is an exoskeleton across the knee joint. There, inside here is a motor that's under our control, and we can provide torque to it as a function of their step frequency. Okay, and then we have a very complicated protocol, so bear with me on this. What we do first is we have people walking on a treadmill, constant speed, for 18 minutes. I guess first they stood here, and then they walked for 12 minutes. And this is the step frequency we're measuring during this baseline condition. And they're wearing the device, but the controller's off. The knee is free to move. And the resistance that the device provides is really low under that situation, but they're still wearing it. So when we engage it, the only thing that changes is that we're putting the controller on, not that they're wearing the device or not wearing the device. Okay, and there is the step frequency you measure during this period. We call the initial preferred step frequency. And then we do the first adaptation period where the controller's on, as denoted by this red line here. This means the controller is on, and measure their step frequency during this period. And then we give them what we call, and we can measure the average step frequency at the end of this period. We call it pre-exploration, because what follows is an exploration period where we ask them to walk with higher step frequencies and lower step frequencies. Like basically, they're exploring the new rules of this new world we've dropped them in, which is giving them a different cost landscape. We're saying, go out and explore. Try different step frequencies. See if there's something you want to do different. And then not only do we just tell them to explore, we then also use a metronome to force them to explore. And so when you see a red line here, that means a metronome is commanding them to try to this step frequency, or this step frequency, or this step frequency. Right? So this is guided exploration through this new cost landscape. And then we do it sinusoidally, so maybe they need experience where they're slowly walk through the new cost landscape. And then we allow them to freely choose it again. And then we go to the next part of the protocol where we measure whether or not their step frequency has adapted after this exploration. And we hold them at a high penalty in that situation with the metronome, release them, low penalty, release them, and then evaluate step frequencies at various parts of this. Okay? And then we turn off the controller and they can readapt. For those of you who are used to arm manipulatum studies or split belt treadmill studies, where you look at readaptation, which happens after you return them to the original situation, that's what this is. We turn the controller off, they're back to the original situation, and we can determine whether or not their step frequency remains shifted and how quickly they readapt to the original situation. Question? When the controller's on? Oh, in this particular one, I can't remember, but it won't be essential to understand the protocol. Can't remember in this one whether or not it's penalized high or penalized low. I think it's probably penalized low because we tended to give the penalty the first, where this one would be high cost, whereas this hold would be potentially a lower cost. Okay, and then we do what's called cost mapping. Okay, in cost mapping, the idea is they're not free to choose anything. We specify their step frequency for them with a metronome, and we just map out their new cost landscape, right? And we're measuring energetic cost. These are long. They're 6 minutes long because we measure energetic cost in the last 3 minutes of each of these. And then that gives us a data point for our parabola, and we can verify that indeed we've changed the cost landscape. Okay, so that cost mapping is what you'll see here. This is the walking while wearing the device without a controller on. At the range of step frequencies, you can see this parabolic shape again, and that people prefer to walk at the minimum. Okay? And now here's the big question. We engage the controller, function of their step frequency. We're going to penalize their low step frequencies and give less of a penalty to high step frequencies, first, can we shift their cost landscape? Indeed, we can. We can make it so that what was their minimum no longer is. The minimum is now out here somewhere. Right? So if they're going to optimize energetic cost, they now need to prefer a step frequency that is in this region. Certainly, they don't want to stay here. Okay? And do they? This experiment lasted, maybe an hour. They learned these preferred step frequencies over their entire life, and yet they're willing to remap over the course of this short experiment and prefer step frequencies now that are higher than what they did in the original situation. So people are optimizing energetic cost over these short time scales. Remember, we can give the penalize in the opposite direction, and we shift the cost landscape so the minimum no longer is here, it's now out here somewhere. And rather than shift their step frequency to higher step frequencies, we hypothesize that they should shift to lower step frequencies, and indeed people do. Okay, so this is that they are minimizing, they're adapting in real time and to a point that minimizes their energetic cost. And it's not, importantly, it's not to where it would minimize the resistance they feel in their leg, which is out at the extremes. Okay, so they're not doing that. Maybe there's some objective function that, other than energetic cost, that also puts them in these two locations. But energetic cost makes sense, and it is the minimum for these participants. So it seems to be consistent with the hypothesis that people are able to do this in real time. So it's over minutes, and also the energy savings they're going after is pretty small, like 5%. And that's like you would save about a peanut's worth of calories in an hour of walking if you wanted to save 5%. So it's pretty sensitive. Yeah.
I was wondering if you took into consideration of the body temperature and room temperature, and what is the effect of raising the body temperature or room temperature on the preferred frequent, let's say, stride frequency or the energetic cost?
Do you have an idea? Sounds like you have a hypothesis in mind.
Actually, based on two things. One is the physical aspect and the other is psychological, in my opinion. I do not know, I'm not that sure about that, but if the condition is really like cold, maybe they walk with more determination, faster, and they preferred more fast-paced walking. And also, so as the body temperature goes up and raises, we assume and we think that the metabolism rate will increase, and maybe there will be differences between two different people, maybe. So I was wondering, what's your idea on this aspect?
So I suspect that, like in this case, these experiments, speed is controlled, right? It's constant. What we're changing is step frequency. And so they can't walk faster in the sense of speed. They can choose higher step frequencies. But so given that speed itself isn't under their control, like even if you change body temperature, their energetic minimum is going to lie at the same step frequency. It'll just shift everything up and down, basically.
So there is no significant difference until next, say, second half of the cycle?
No, the second half of the cycle? What do you mean? Sorry?
I mean, as it goes on, that person walks, so the temperature goes up because of the person's moving, let's say. And what happens to the, let's say, that metabolic power?
That happens to the metabolic.
What is the effect of temperature? Could you control that? Could you see that? What was the effect of body temperature?
We didn't measure it, didn't control it, but I don't anticipate it to be a problem, because for these sort of experiments, you would need that to be a problem. You need it to be a function of step frequency, right? Like in this case, we don't care what the absolute energetic cost is. We just care that it's a function, whether or not it's a function of step frequency.
Thank you.
Typically in these sort of experiments, people don't measure body temperature and correct for it. And I don't really even know what would need to be corrected, but maybe we can talk about that afterwards.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? We do another one. Great.
Hi.
Hi.
just wanted to ask, I don't have any hypothesis, but I was wondering if there's a difference with regards to leg length or like heights of different participants?
Yeah, so like if you put people on a treadmill at a constant speed, and some were short and some were tall, the tall ones would walk with a slower step frequency. But so there is like the size of an individual does affect what step frequencies they choose, but they wouldn't affect this pattern. For one, we normalized everything to be a % of their preferred step frequency, which sort of counts for size. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, it turns out that the step frequency scales with the square root of leg length divided by gravity. It's like a pendulum does. This works across animal size, from everything from a shrew up to an elephant, including different sized humans. And this scaling works really well.
Okay, thank you.
Something called dimensional analysis, if you're interested in that. Okay, so this is just that people do energetic optimization in real time. Okay, so let me tell you, if you remember that protocol, right? It was complicated. There's a whole bunch of things that was going on. And one of them was, maybe I'll just pop back to it really quickly. Right, there was this case here where we engaged the controller and they had no exploration, right? We just turned on the controller and then we plopped them in a new cost landscape. The rules of the world have changed, but they haven't had any experience with that new world yet, right? So the question is, would they have done that adaptation in that situation? And then there is this exploration period. Maybe they needed that in order to discover the new minimum. And it turns out that that is the case. Sorry, lots of builds here. This is the penalized high situation. So the new minimum is at a lower step frequency. And this is the penalized low situation. So the new minimum is at a high step frequency. And you can see that in this original experiment, just turning the controller on, just dropping them in the new world, isn't enough for them to learn their new optimal step frequency, right? They just persisted to use the step frequency that was originally optimal, but no longer is. They're energetically irrational in this situation. But after the exploration period, where we gave them all kinds of different experience, now you can see that they've shifted their step frequency to the new minimum, right, in both directions. So there's something about that exploration period that these participants needed in order to adapt. And this exploration period had self-exploration. It had holds with the metronome that were at low step frequency, at like lower costs and higher costs. It had this sinusoidal exploration through it. So it was a very rich experience. It's not clear if people needed all of that or just some of that. Right? Maybe there are particular cues in here that triggered the adaptation to start. And so that's what we set out to do next, is to figure out what's the mechanism of which this energy optimization is occurring. And we did a bigger study, more participants. And it turned out in this bigger participant pool, where we had about 40 subjects, is that in this case, there was a subset of the participants that did spontaneously adapt, that didn't need the exploration, the guided exploration that we had. But instead, when you turn on the controller, dump them in the new world, they would automatically find the new energy optimum. And this is the difference here between what we call the non-spontaneous initiator that doesn't change their step frequency versus the spontaneous initiator that does without any of the exploration. You might consider these guys, one word for them, which I like, is these are your exploiters, and these are your explorers. So these continue to do what they would always do, even though that's no longer optimal because they don't have the right experience yet. What distinguishes these two is that the spontaneous initiators, the ones who did adapt, they have a naturally higher step frequency than the ones who didn't. So it's almost like they're walking through the world in preparation for new things to learn. by always choosing a higher variability in their step frequency. And even though there's a penalty for that normally, anything different from the optimum is expensive, and so variability is expensive, they're choosing to walk that way in order to possibly learn new things. Sometimes when I give this talk and explain that, people are like, oh, what else do you know about these people? Well, we don't know much else, but the people are like, are they more likely to do drugs? Or are they more likely to try new experiences? Like, they have ideas about the personality that these people must have in order to want to be exploring all the time. And so that's one pattern we found in the bigger pool set, is that there is a group that are explorers spontaneously initiate optimization without additional exposure. Okay. But for the rest of them, right, the ones that don't spontaneously initiate but require experience, there's a very interesting pattern, which is that the signal that they need is experience with the lower cost gate. So when you, in both the metronome-guided perturbations and the self-guided exploration, right? So we use a metronome, and we release them from a higher cost. They don't change their preferred step frequency. Or they're exploring different step frequencies on their own, and when we say, okay, now choose your preferred, and they begin with a higher cost, they don't change away from the original. But if we hold them low, so they experience a lower cost and release them, they now shift their preferred. Or if they're doing a self-guided exploration and we say choose from when they're already at a low cost, they now prefer the lower cost gate. So it's like they need experience with the low cost. It's not enough just to give them a cue that they're in a new environment, they're in a new landscape. They have to give them experience where that new landscape has a lower cost, and that initiates the beginning of remapping what their cost landscape looks like and what their preferred gate is. Okay, a little bit more about the optimization process. So it looks like it's local searching, because when you do, this is what I said before, if you release them from a higher cost, which is up here, they rapidly shoot back to their original preferred. This is like 2 steps. So they're just going back to the original preferred without optimizing, and they're doing so rapidly. They predict what their preferred step frequency is. But when they do optimize, which is what's happening here, we're releasing them from a low cost, and now they're slowly changing their step frequency, discovering that this is where the new minimum is. It's not, the search doesn't bounce around everywhere, like a brute force search of a new landscape, where you might do something like, if you're used to optimization, something that looks like a genetic algorithm where you're trying a bunch of different things. Instead, they're searching locally. They're like, oh, okay, there's something to be learned here. I'm going to change my step frequency slightly around where I am, measure my cost, change it slightly again, measure my cost, and doing this local search. Okay, and it's slower than here. This was 2 steps, whereas this is 100, like this is or dozens of steps, and it's local. And then after they've learned that there's a new energetically optimal step frequency and where it is, if you then hold them away from it with the metronome and release them, they learn to predict. So now, if you hold them high or you hold them low and you release them, within a couple of steps, they now come to their new energetically optimal gate. So they've learned to predict where their new optimal gate is. That's part of this mechanism. And it doesn't matter now if you hold them at a higher cost, because they've learned that there's a new optimum. So the same behavior they had here to predict the suboptimal one, they now use to predict the optimal one. Okay. Okay, so here was the behavior I just described. It is that some people will initiate spontaneously, but also all people will initiate after experience with a low-cost gate. That the search looks like it's local, where they converge to new optima using that local search criteria. That once they learn it, they use prediction to rapidly settle on new energetic optima, to reconverge to new energetic optima. And I didn't show it to you, but there's also gradual unlearning of the optima. So when you remove the controller, then they don't rapidly go back to what they had learned for their whole life. Instead, they have to relearn it on basically the same time scale. Any questions? That was a lot of things. I'm not going to tell you about how we think the brain does it. But those are the general patterns. Yeah.
Is in a Bayesian way, right? And then I will part how we talk, how we are, complex Bayesian machines. We're always trying to predict the future based on the experience and updating the prediction model, right? So in your opinion, what are the cues we're using? Because, the metabolic course takes a bit of time, right? You have to walk a little bit in a more expensive metabolic course, so you can feel that you're, expending more. So what's happening there?
Well, the way that we measure energetic cost experimentally, you can measure changes. There's a small delay, and then you can measure changes very quickly after that. They take some time to rise, and there's lots of noise. And so that's why you think of them as being like, they take a long time to make those measurements. But that doesn't need to be true inside the body. So there are energetic sensors of metabolism that reside in your muscles. You probably know mostly about muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. But there are also group 3 and group 4 afferents that are sensitive to the byproducts of metabolism that are known to control blood pressure and breathing. Their role in the motor control is unknown. And there are good candidate sensors for locally measuring the byproducts of metabolism that occur immediately because your muscles are doing it, right? So they're using ATP, they're producing ADP, they're changing the local environment of the muscle. That would be very logical candidates for the instantaneous sensing of energetic cost. And then if we get to it, I'll tell you about another possible mechanism which we have done experiments on. But we may run out of time, so.
Thanks.
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so you said it as Bayesian. I think about it as reinforcement learning. Those two things aren't in contradiction with each other, but and I'm going to walk you through how we think about it as reinforcement learning. So, and what we want to do is have a computational algorithm that produces these behaviors that I just described to you. Right? And so one of them is that it initiates either spontaneously or after experience with a lower cost gate. Okay? So here is, what this is showing is this spontaneous initiation data from our experiments. This was one of those spontaneous initiators where when we engage the controller, they spontaneously converge on their new energetic minimum. This is the step frequency, this is time, and a good computational algorithm that explains what the nervous system's doing would produce data that look like this. Okay? So down here, what we have is the controller off cost landscape. This is all simulated stuff. And then the cost landscape when the controller's turned on. And the blue dot is what the algorithm is choosing to do. And you're gonna see it produce a new cost landscape that's inside the simulated nervous system, what it's learning, right? So this is the controller off, what happened in the real world. Green is the controller on, what's happening in the real world. And the blue is what is being learned. Okay, so maybe I'm going to build this and then come back to it, just so you can see the algorithm, see it working first. So the simulation down below, the blue is what is in the mind of the simulation, and okay, I think we hit a technical difficulty with the website version of things. Let's see if it'll work this time. Okay, I'm gonna have to describe to you what this video looks like. And okay, unfortunately, what happens is when we get it going, this will keep going, and then this is learning. The blue is the predicted cost landscape that the algorithm is learning. And it will, when the controller's off, it's scooting around the original cost landscape based upon the noise it has in its execution of its action. And it's just relearning the original cost landscape over and over again. When we put the controller on, then it will then shoot to the new cost. It will start to learn the new cost landscape and update this to look like the new controller. And the way it works is that, these are the key parts of it, in this simple spontaneous initiator, is that you have inside of the nervous system of this simulation, you have a predicted energetic cost. For those of you familiar with reinforcement learning, these Q's and A's and so on are used from there. But this value function in the language of reinforcement learning is our predicted energetic cost. It's what's learned by this model. And it chooses what action, what step frequency it's going to take based upon what its prediction, okay? Its predicted energetic cost. And the policy is to minimize this, the predicted energetic cost and choose that step frequency. And then there's always a little bit of noise or variability that is either purposeful or not purposeful in that action. That means it doesn't just do the same thing over and over again. But when it takes that action, it's then going to measure its energetic cost. It's going to determine its reward, okay? And it's going to update this predicted energetic cost based on that new reward. So it thinks it's going to get a certain energetic cost. It chooses that step frequency. The cost landscape has changed. It gets a different cost than it's predicted, and then updates its cost based upon that. And then for the next step, it chooses its step frequency from its prediction, again, which has just been updated, gets a new reward, updates, and this goes over and over again. And that's how, and this produces behavior in this simple version, much like we see here. Okay, so the idea is that once you turn the controller on, this will slowly learn the new cost landscape. In the non-spontaneous initiators, it requires, if you remember, when you engage the controller, it didn't change its step frequency. And so it looks a little different. Here, what happens is there is a check where it says, if the reward is less than what I expect, then I am going to update my prediction. But if it's more than what I expect, I'm not. And it's this that triggers once it keeps getting costs that are higher than it expects, then it doesn't update its predicted energetic cost. Once it gets a lower signal, it's like, oh, there's something to be gained here. I'm going to start to learn. And then take steps, get a reward, update my prediction, take another step, get a reward, update my prediction. And adding that produces, that's disappointing, sorry guys, produces something that does not adapt when things are, when there's no guided exploration. But when you give it a hold that is either high, then it turns out it'll shoot back, the simulation will shoot back to what it originally preferred. But if you do give it a hold that's low, a lower cost, it'll slowly converge. And I'm just gonna, these are no longer meaningful, so I'm just gonna give you this simulation results, and you can see that simulation, hold it high, release it, shoots back to the original preferred, just like the data, hold it low, release it, and it now gradually converges to the new energetic cost, just like the data. Okay. And once it's learned it, if you remember, once it's learned the new cost landscape, it should rapidly predict both from experiencing a low cost and a high cost. And in fact, that's what happens. So it gives you the same basic behavior. And if you then shift back to turn the controller off, go back to the original cost landscape, the landscape we all grew up in, that we've had our life's experience with until this moment when you're in our experiments, then there's a gradual unlearning. And this algorithm has that same gradual unlearning. It's like the readaptation you often see in learning experiments. Brock. Every step. Once a step. You take a step, like a walking step, right? first of all, you choose a step frequency based upon your prediction, your value function, right? Like this is what I'm going to choose for this step because it, in my model in my brain, it minimizes my cost. Take it, get a reward of what the energetic cost is once per step, update the value function once per step, keep going.
And so is there any consideration for like the temporal nature of this? Like does it take into account time history?
It doesn't. I mean, the value function is the cost landscape, and it's not as a function of time. So it doesn't matter when you get experience with a given step frequency in this very simple model. You can do better than this, undoubtedly. But that wasn't, our goal is to do simple as possible.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Babak?
So I have a quick question. So what is the take home from this Q learning, reinforcement learning? Is the claim that this is what is happening in the brain, or the idea is to have a model that can replicate, then we can do experiments on it and see if we can predict what a person would do if a hypothetical.
For me, it's both, and it's almost always both, right? I like a simple model that captures explains the phenomena we've measured simply as possible, right? And so that's our hypothesis about what's going on inside the nervous system. And then use it to design new experiments that are aimed to falsify that model, which is ultimately a hypothesis. And so we tend to use them for both things. But the insight into the nervous system is that people choose how they walk with a prediction of what is energetically optimal. They update that prediction as they get new information. And so you can imagine it being done in other ways, but this appears to be what humans do. Yeah.
Like inverse reinforcement learning, where you're now trying to compute what is the underlying objective function governing human movement, kind of tying back to your original slide.
Yeah, you could do that in a systematic way. In a way, that's what we did here too, just not systematically. We imagined what I guess in the inverse reinforcement learning, you're trying to back out the objective function, right?
Correct. Here
Yeah.
you assume the value function is the energetic cost minimization.
Yeah, you could try that. I think you'd end up with like an infinite number of possibilities. Okay, so here's the idea. I've said many of these things, but the idea is that viewing energy optimization, I remember at the beginning I said, hey, we're going to study energy optimization in walking. But maybe this applies to other movements other than walking. And maybe this applies to optimizing objective functions other than energy. So here, the idea is reinforcement learning actually captures many of these energy optimizing behaviors in walking. But maybe it also is how people do optimization more generally for other objective functions and other movements. And it captures key features of this particular model system, which I've described already. And maybe I just won't read these to you. And with the main conclusion being the nervous system may learn to navigate new energetic environments using relatively simple reinforcement learning algorithms. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. I think, do we have 10 minutes left? Yeah, we've had lots of questions as we go. I'm going to suggest I tell you about one more study. You guys ask me questions as we go. Yeah? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. Okay, this is related to your question about how it's sensed. Okay, when it's in some ways it has been dogma that people can't minimize energetic costs because there's no energetic sensor. That's not based upon anything because I just explained one to you that actually seems pretty reasonable. Another possibility is that, which was this one here. Okay, I won't repeat that one. Another possibility is that we use blood gas sensors that are used to also control ventilation and blood pressure. We have ones in our aorta and ones in our brainstem that are sensitive to oxygen and carbon dioxide in our blood, like very sensitive. If you change it, then you'll change your breathing and you'll change blood pressure. And those, your breathing rate is, you change your breathing rate because you need to bring more oxygen in your body because you're using more energy and you need to use aerobic metabolism to reestablish that energy in your body. So like these are intimately related to these energy systems. Another possibility is that rather than measuring in real time, rather than measuring energy directly, like you could with these two ways, is maybe you've calibrated a model that predicts energy use based upon other sorts of proprioception. For example, you have muscle spindles that measure muscle velocity. You have Golgi tendon organs that measure muscle force. Force times velocity is power. And you can imagine that some combination of those sensory information would give you accurate information about the metabolic power that your body's using, right? So this is like a proxy way to estimate energetic cost, and that you've learned that relationship over time. Maybe evolutionary time, maybe development time, but these are low latency sensory systems that could allow you to predict energetic cost. Okay. So these are three possibilities. My favorite one is this one, but I have ideas about how to test it, but we haven't done it yet. But one that we realized we could test early was the role of this sensory system. So here's what we did. So rather than use an exoskeleton that controls the resistance applied to the leg as a function of step frequency, we built a system that controls the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood as a function of your walking step frequency. So the way this works is that when you breathe out, at the end of each breath, the end tidal, which means at the end of each breath, values of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your breath are good indicators of the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood. So we have a good way to sense blood O2 and CO2 by measuring these end tidal O2 and CO2 values. Okay, so we can measure those. And then we built a system where we control how much oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen people are breathing in by controlling how much is in a bag that they're breathing from. So with every breath, we will measure how much oxygen, carbon dioxide in their blood, and then we will change the concentration of O2 and CO2 that's in this bag, and then they breathe from that bag. And so we're trying to, in that way, we can steer their O2 and CO2 in their blood to what we want it to be. And then we make that, so now that's how we control O2 and CO2 in their blood, and then when we make that a function of their step frequency. And so what we can do is, remember, this is our cost landscape. Rather than change their actual cost landscape, we can change it virtually in their blood. We can make it so that those sensors think that their cost landscape is shifted, and we do so by putting, in this case, we've shifted it to be a higher step frequency where the minimum is occurring. So that means there's more oxygen in their blood at the high step frequency, and there is, which would mean they're using less oxygen, right? So if there's more in their blood, they've used less. So this would shift in this direction. And there is less carbon dioxide, which means that they produce less carbon dioxide. They've used less energy in this. That would be the view in the blood level. And so there's less CO2 here. And we can also shift in the other direction by reversing that. So now there's less O2 at low step frequencies and more CO2. I'm sorry, more O2 and less CO2, which would be shifted this way. Right? So we've simulated it. This is what the system looks like. That's Sean, who built the system. He is a... I'm going to start that again. So Sean was a postdoc in my lab. He's a prof at San Diego State now. And those are the gas canisters. You go through these valves. Grad student in my group, and she was responsible for the first few studies I showed you. Okay. So this is a very effective way to change things physiologically. So if we're shifting this to minimize, in this case, if we penalize high step frequencies, we expect ventilation to go up at high step frequencies, and it does, and be lower at low step frequencies, and that's what happens. And if we penalize low, then we expect ventilation go up at low step frequencies, and it does, and be lower at high step frequencies. So we are able to make physiological shifts to what people are doing as a function of their step frequency by controlling the breathing environment. That's good. That means that we're doing the manipulation we want to do. Also, if you ask people their perceived exertion, whether or not it feels harder or easier, this system also shifts that. So it feels easier for them to walk, in this case, at the lower than they prefer. They report that when we're trying to shift the energetic minimum to be lower, or higher than they would normally prefer when we try and shift the minimum to be higher, the virtual minimum. That's good. It's working in that way too. However, people don't change their preferred step frequency. So they did with the EXO that resisted them as a function of their step frequency. They don't in this system that changes their O2 and CO2 in their blood as a function of their step frequency. Even though they perceive different step frequencies to be easier, their ventilation would be lower, they don't shift. And that's what this is showing here. It doesn't matter how much exploration we give them, they're not shifting. We also did this over multiple days because maybe it just takes more time than we had accounted for, and they still don't shift. I view this as the negative finding I'm most proud of because it, like, I don't know, it's a pretty wild experiment in the first place, but it seems like, at least to our resolution, that these sensors of blood gas levels are not being used as the sensor of energetic cost in the body, because even though you can manipulate them, shift them in the directions you want, have people perceive that they've been shifted, people do not change their behavior. Okay. So there are other studies, and I will not get to them, so I'm going to just flip through here to a acknowledgement slide. Okay. And while I'm doing that, feel free to ask me questions.
There are a large group of people watching the seminar online, and there are a couple of questions from the online audiences. I'm going to read the first question from the online audience, and it says, how do you think your findings could impact future research or practical applications in your field?
I heard practical applications, and then I didn't hear the few words after that.
Future research or practical applications in your field?
Well, I mean, for this group, one implication of this is that people have a strong, it seems like, internal drive to minimize energetic cost, and that dictates their behavior. So if you want them to do something different, like say it's a stroke patient that you want to walk symmetrically, maybe they want to walk symmetrically. If their nervous system's telling them that their asymmetric gait is minimizing energetic cost, then you're competing against that all the time. And that really you need to align those two competing interests. You need to align what they want to do consciously with what their nervous system wants them to do. So if you want it to be symmetrical, then you need to make that the energetic minimum, or else it will be transient. And so that's one application of that idea to this realm. In general, I think if you want to affect people's behavior effectively, then you need to understand what they're trying to do in the first place. And this is that.
Are there other questions from people in the audience, in the room? Otherwise, I can read another question from online people. This one says, are there opportunities for cross-disciplinary collaboration in your research?
Are there opportunities for in my research? Yeah, sure. I mean, we're driven, so we like to be driven by the questions that we think are important and not so much the field that we're in. So you see that in some of these results where there's some engineering going on where we're building new things. We're doing lots of biomechanics. There's neuroscience. There's more exercise physiology related things. And as questions arise that are of interest, so do collaborations. That's in my view, that you try and collaborate with people who understand these things already. I think clinically, it's like some of this has been applied to kids with CP. Some of it is thought about in terms of split belt walking rehabilitation for spinal cord injury and stroke. And I'm open to any of those ideas. Yeah.
So just building off of that, can you maybe like provide some examples of like clinical collaborators that you've worked with to like kind of translate some of this research to a clinical setting?
I mean, one place where it shows up clinically is that there is, there's been a view for a while about adaptation as being driven by sensory motor prediction error. And you see this coming out particularly out of the split belt walking groups who use split belt walking to study adaptation in both in healthy adults, but also as use it as a tool after stroke to try and produce symmetrical gait. And this says, hey, another alternative hypothesis is that it's not sensory prediction error. It's actually energy optimization, and that this sort of intervention won't work, at least it won't work long term. And so there's an example of how it's been applied into sort of more of a clinical world where people rethink whether or not that's clinically a good way to approach adaptation, like long-term adaptation for symmetry.